right, so we're going to move on to the next agenda item,
I hope so.
and that's a presentation from APD Forward. And what APD Forward has done with the help of Robbie Heckman, who's here, also Paul Hato, and Alice Lou Cook from APD Forward. They've taken a more in-depth look at the compliance rate with the settlement agreement as last reported in IMR 4. And I think it's a very good way of encapsulating the compliance rate for where the department is supposed to be at this point in the process. So I'll have Robbie come up and explain his data, and
I think Gin's going to come up and just
okay.
kind of introduce folks to APD Forward, and Paul has some handouts.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Give us that.
So I'm Jenny Metzler, and I'm the Executive Director of Albuquerque Healthcare for the Homeless. I'm also on the steering committee of APD. You know me. Okay, I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes. So I'm also on the steering committee of APD Forward, and I've had the good fortune of meeting with some of the CPCs to talk about homelessness, community, mental health issues, and law enforcement, and how we can all work together. Most recently in the Southeast, which is where I also live. I started out with you guys very early on, so I've seen some of the evolution. But I'm a little bit of the peanut gallery for tonight. I just wanted to be part of this kind of segue, connecting APD Forward. And many of you have heard this and know this and have seen some of the work we've done. We are a diverse coalition of 18 organizations and 4 individuals, 3 who are affected family members. We convened and organized shortly after Mr. Boyd was shot and killed, and with the community response, and just wanting to pull together somehow to have a community-based group that was looking from many perspectives at successful reform for the entire community. We are organized around 4 clear objectives. One was to help ensure from a community base, again, that there would be a court-enforceable settlement agreement, that there would be an independent qualified monitor, and that there would be sufficient resources allocated by the city of Albuquerque to ensure long-standing, long-lasting, sustainable reforms. And our 4th objective, which is the one that we're here tonight to speak to, and in the midst of, that is probably the biggest, is really to have a framework for community accountability, the feedback loop of sharing with community what's going on broadly, and also giving feedback to the process. So my colleagues are going to speak to that a little bit more, and for the data geeks in the room tonight, I think this is going to be a very exciting presentation on some things that we have done and some things that we're exploring and thinking about doing. So,
Yes. Thank you.
So the agenda item says the compliance database, but what we're really going to be presenting is kind of output from the compliance database and trying to make more accessible, kind of understandable, kind of using some techniques to see exactly where and track where APD is in the compliance process. And all of what we're going to present here tonight is derived from the monitor's evaluation reports. So that's the whole piece of it. So the database and the goals that went along with the database were to track and analyze, synthesize APD's progress, identify patterns, good and bad, and kind of report back out to the community, what those patterns mean and their importance. Also, as I said earlier, just making the monitoring team's reports a little more accessible and digestible to the public, and provide ourselves a centralized platform to track compliance, but also make the compliance kind of cumulative. And so the contents of the database are very simple. We have the CASA paragraphs in there, the court-approved settlement agreement paragraphs. I'm referring to them as the monitoring team's categories, but they're the categories that are in the CASA, the 9 categories that the monitoring team reports out on. And then APD's categories, I'm calling them, those two are in the CASA. And you have the very first handout that you have that has the, just a second. This one right here has all the 9 categories with the Roman numerals, and then underneath are what I'm calling APD's categories, which are, again, the categories that are in the CASA, but when APD reports out in a response to the monitoring team's reports, they use these finer-grained subcategories of the larger categories. And we'll go over that a little bit. So that's that first handout. I have the metadata. We have the metadata for each one of the reports in there. And then, of course, the results of all the independent monitor reports, the compliance determinations, and then we also have page references for where they are, and then some notes along with that. So just again, the categories are kind of grouping mechanisms that allow us to make sense out of the 280 some paragraphs that are in there, and kind of drill down on the specifics and see where APD is vis-a-vis these sorting categories. So again, the monitoring team categories are these 9 categories, and so you can see there, use of force has 77. Use of force has 77 paragraphs associated with it, and then that breaks down into 11 subcategories that, these add up to 77, but so use of force principle only has 4 paragraphs associated with it. And then you drill all the way down, so the use of force principles paragraphs are 14, 15, 16, and 17. So the monitoring team's reports, this is kind of what provoked, maybe that's not a good verb, APDForward to try to grapple with, because I've been kind of unsatisfied with reading the summaries that the monitor puts out. I mean, and one of the things that I'll point out here, and first of all, I want to reiterate APDForward, we feel like the monitoring team's doing a fantastic job. And so if it sounds like there's a criticism here, it's maybe only a criticism of the presentation and the accessibility of those reports. We find it hard to believe that the citizenry of Albuquerque is going to sit down and pore over a 385-page report. And so, but that's one of the things we're trying to address with this database. But so one of the first things here is the monitoring team is reporting out primary compliance, secondary compliance, operational compliance. It's interesting, these certainly add up to a lot more than 100%. So the question is what's missing in that particular presentation. And I attended one of the public meetings with Judge Brack right after the 4th report came out in November, and these numbers were being repeated a lot at that hearing. And so the question is, in looking at those, what are the other missing percentages? And so if we just look at primary compliance, the 83% reported 232 paragraphs, there's 17% that the monitoring team determined were not compliant. Not compliant. Then if we go down, secondary compliance, we're in compliance with 114, but 158 were determined not compliant. And as you all maybe know, or you should be aware, that it was the 4th report when most of the requirements of the CASA came due. And so there's a lot of work there. Operational compliance, 202 of the paragraphs were found to be not in compliance. And so it's one thing to report them out with this, but the reality of it is, and the way that the monitoring team's methods work, is that primary compliance, and maybe some of you know this well, that's the policy part. So that's the procedures, the SOPs, the training curricula. Secondary compliance is the implementation, having the supervisory staff and the field officers, and you have what the monitoring team refers to artifacts that are produced as part of that, which are the reports, the disciplinary records. So that's secondary compliance. Operational compliance is, as the monitor puts it, APD owns the policies. There's full accountability. Sergeants, lieutenants, command staff are on board. They're what the monitoring team refers to as a learning organization. There's been a lot of talk about the Six Sigma process, where you're evaluating and what's going on in the field, and the supervisors are evaluating that to see if there are, problems with that, and then where those problems are. Was that problem in the training of that particular officer? Was that problem with the policies and the training itself? And then revisiting those things and making corrective action. Now, the thing that's important to note is that you cannot be in secondary compliance without being in primary compliance. You can't have the implementation without the policies. Similarly, you cannot be in operational compliance if you're not in primary and secondary compliance. So they're interrelated, and reporting them out kind of the way the monitor did at the end is a little, it's not intentional, but it's just a little misleading. And so one of the things we did was we created an algorithm that went through and took the compliance. Now that second handout, the one that's not stapled, that's two-sided, it looks like this. It has some blue lettering on it. And that is an output from the database that shows you and kind of inverts, it kind of inverts the hierarchy. So what we did was we have the, and this one is specific to the community policing councils, the 5 paragraphs that pertain to you guys. But so we have the larger grouping, the community engagement and oversight, then the community policing councils, and then the paragraph is listed. But then under the paragraph is each successive monitoring report. And so you can see just in one shot there how the monitor has evaluated those 5 paragraphs. Now, so what we did was we took those and created an algorithm, and these are the essentially the nominative values of that algorithm that can cant those primary compliance, secondary compliance, operational compliance into a single expression. So where are they in the compliance process for that particular paragraph? And so that's the blue, the blue letters here essentially give you what we call a compliance summary. And so that means it's a single expression of where they are based on a concatenation of the three scores on primary, secondary, and operational compliance. Then we went one step further and just assigned some values to them. So operational compliance that's APD being in full compliance with the CASA or with a particular paragraph. And primary non-compliance, as I said, is as far out of compliance as you can be. So you don't have the policies in place to have the supervisory staff and the reports done. So then from that, we just took and created a simple, so I pretty much already went over that for you guys. And that's the stuff you will not find. These things in the monitor report, I want to make that clear. It is an expression based on that algorithm of what is in the monitor's report. And so if we now use these categories and we get our percentages to add up to 100 and we provide an output, you had 25% are in operational compliance. So that's all the paragraphs that are in operational compliance are 70. There's 6 that are in just primary compliance, and then the 16 that are in operational non-compliance, but you have 46 that are in primary non-compliance. So that means that they're as far out of compliance as you could be. And the way that you go, so we go back to the monitor's report. Remember he said that there were 232 paragraphs in primary compliance. Well, those are a subset of these, right? Because remember I said you have to be in primary compliance in order to be evaluated for secondary compliance. And so if you add these up, that's 232. The 114 paragraphs in secondary compliance are the ones that are in operational compliance, of course, and in operational non-compliance because all 44 of those are in secondary compliance. And then, of course, there's the 70 with that. So we then calculated what we are referring to as a compliance ratio. And it's really just a heuristic device to show where APD is in the compliance process vis-a-vis the monitor's evaluations. So I want to emphasize that the numbers are not necessarily important here. It's a continuum from complete compliance, operational compliance, to primary non-compliance is as far out as you could be. And so if we aggregate all in the fourth report, the 278 paragraphs, and we can plot out, there's where they landed in the monitoring report 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the other thing that's important to remember with the monitoring reports, is that, as the monitoring team always points out, they're always behind the curve. So the fourth report, the period that they're reporting out on is April 1st to July 31st, 2016. So it's important to note that because there's been confusion in the community and about, and APD trying to convey information about where they are. It's at least ostensibly seems conflicting with the monitoring reports, but that may be because people are looking at the monitoring report that's referring back in time and APD's talking more currently. So if we kind of drill down on the fourth monitoring report and we use some of these categories to get a kind of a finer resolution of where APD is, and we'll use what I'm referring to as the monitoring team categories, the 9 categories. Use of force, specialized units, crisis intervention, policies and training, misconduct, intake and investigation and adjudication, staffing, management, supervision. Remember, this is the fourth report. Recruitment, selection, and training, officer assistance programs, community engagement, and oversight. Okay? So maybe now, let's look at use of force and use the finer grain categories, use of force principles, and so on. And there's where APD was for the first 3 monitoring reports and the fourth report. And I'll just spin through these. Use of firearms, there's the first 3 reports and the fourth report. Electronic control weapons, fourth report. Crowd control incident management, fourth report. Use of force reporting, fourth report. Force investigations, supervisory force investigations, force investigations by internal affairs, force review board is geometrically out of compliance. And so now, oh, sorry, I thought that was the last one. Multi-agency task force, there are 5 paragraphs. And use of force training, and there are 4 paragraphs there. So you see, as of the fourth monitor's report, APD has a lot of, it'll be interesting to see the 5th report where APD lands. And so we just looked at use of force, and I thought, given the audience here, that we should look at community engagement and oversight paragraphs. And so there's where and now we're looking at what I'm referring to as the APD categories, the finer grained categories underneath that rubric. And you also have that in your handout. So there's where community engagement, problem-oriented policing lands, community meetings and public information, community policing councils. And I also, for the community policing councils, this one-page handout will kind of walk you through. If you look at the fourth report for each one of the paragraphs, it'll kind of walk you through the monitor's assessment of each of those 5 paragraphs that pertain to the CPCs. The Civilian Police Oversight Agency, you guys are doing well. I think some of the paragraphs are even the ones that are pulling you down a little bit, maybe out of your control directly. Anyway, so for each one of these categories, when you see there's 22 paragraphs that are in aggregate that we're looking at there. That so then the next step would be to kind of drill down and see where each one of those paragraphs are and look at what the problem areas are, or celebrate the successes of APD.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
So the scores that we're seeing on here are based on whether APD has reached operational compliance?
No. The score is
Take one, if you just look at
no,
the
that
little-
score is for the score that you're seeing on there is for a single paragraph.
Okay, but, so let's look at, because that's the simplest one for us to look at. Let's look at paragraph 266. We're in secondary non-compliance with the evaluation date ending 7/31/2016. So, where should APD be at this point in the CASA?
That's a really good question, and that was why I made the point earlier that, and I think the monitors made this point multiple times, is that APD was, I think, I'll try to paraphrase the way the monitors characterized it, they were overly ambitious in trying to come into compliance. And if you remember in the first monitor's report, he made a really big deal about he was going to start APD out as not yet due. That was something that the monitoring team had not, to my knowledge at least, or based on my memory of reading the first report, that they did not do the first time because it caused great consternation. It came right out of the gate and they're non-compliant and everything. Well, APD put together a very aggressive schedule, and I think that, that's impacting some of this. So it was the fourth report where almost everything came due, and so some of this is a reflection of that, of them not really having enough time for the monitor, but also there are serious concerns expressed in the report. One thing you can do with the report is just go through and look at all the underlined text.
So there was never a line drawn that says you'll be 100% compliant by this date in the future?
Well, my understanding was that came due 2 years in.
Right, there was supposed to be operational compliance within 2 years so that there could be a 2-year observation of the operational compliance.
And then I think James Boyd happened sometime within this time frame, right?
James Boyd happened like 3 weeks or a month before the DOJ's findings were published.
Okay.
Before. A month before the DOJ's findings letter.
So on so 7/31/2016 was the end of that
Reporting period.
that initial 2-year period where APD had said, yeah, we're going to have everything done. And now we're looking at it as, that was overambitious. So yes, we're behind on that because the timeline that was set has now run out. Okay,
Right, yes.
gotcha.
Are there any penalties to that or consequences for overlooking for APD?
The 2-year period actually expire in mid-November.
Okay,
So the next report will actually get you through the 2-year period.
okay,
Remember, the beginning of the process starts on November 14th, 2000.
14. Yeah, November 14th.
Yeah, November 14th,
Okay.
when the CASA was executed by the parties. The other thing you need to remember is that the 2-year period for coming into full compliance was aspirational. Okay, so there wasn't a drop dead deadline saying you must be in compliance. The goal was to try to achieve compliance by November of 2016. But the agreement remains in place until APD comes into full compliance and then sustains compliance for 2 years after. So if APD comes into compliance 3 years in, then they have to maintain compliance for 2 years longer. If it takes 3.5 years, then it'll be 5.5 years total. So, but it was an aspirational goal, and that's why I think the question was asked, was there any kind of a penalty for not meeting? And so no, the goal is still to come into full compliance and then sustain for 2 years.
Your relationships between operational, secondary, and primary, is there any time during the analysis where you see that an operational compliance was in compliance, but then something happened in secondary and primary that was related to that particular line of compliance and it knocked it down?
Yeah, they have.
Set back.
Yeah, I mean, I went through it really quick, but there have been multiple instances where they've been in secondary compliance or maybe even operational compliance has been it's reevaluated, each paragraph's reevaluated each time, and they've come out of compliance. One of the things was that I'm thinking of was under use of force was the weapons, and I think there were several officers who were on administrative leave who didn't get the memo, or it wasn't demonstrated that they got the memo, and so the monitor put them in non-compliance, secondary non-compliance with that, with the understanding that the next time they'd probably be in compliance. It would be easy for them to get that out to those officers.
Yeah, I think this has been such a complex issue, and I think there's conflicting information about the timelines and what compliance means for all of these things, and it's been confusing for everyone. And the CPCs have been trying to follow this for the last 2.5 years, and it doesn't get easier.
No.
It's constantly a challenge. I appreciate your input, and I think I have a much better understanding now of what we're really looking at. And I think the public doesn't understand that 3-month delay.
It only took us 2 years.
It's only taken us 2 years to figure this out. So this is something that we'll definitely be discussing at the March CPC meetings. APD is going to come out and talk to us about their views on what they've done, what they've accomplished. So we'll have a chance to talk about this more with the wider community. And I think every time the monitor's report comes out, we got press and we got a ton of questions. So it'll be good to have a chance for those folks to come out to the CPCs and hopefully get some answers on what's going on, what these things mean. So, good.
Excuse me, Elizabeth, is it possible that there could be a press release to explain what you just said, that this goal of 2 years is an aspirational thing?
Let me raise that.
All right. Whether it's your office or someplace else, I think it will help to clear up some questions that might come forward in our meetings.
Yeah.
And we can always refer to that. But
I think that'd be very helpful.
Well, I also think that, that's the exact term that we want to characterize APD's aggressive schedule.
What got my attention that compliance, excessive using force, none. That's interesting. That should be, I would say, first to stop.
Well, that was the other question, that's a good point. Was there a priority set to things? Like, for example, if James Boyd is killed and then there's excessive force and there's an investigation, was there ever a priority set in what needed to be coming to compliance first? Or is it that relationship that caused it not to be?
Well, I mean, to answer your question, I think we would probably go to somebody at APD, but with the monitoring team's methods are exactly that you get the policy, the primary compliance in place first. That needs to be evaluated, and then you move to the next thing.
So, yeah, I think as far as where Selena can probably address.
Yeah, so we've gone over this a couple of times. So the first step for APD was policy and procedures, right? Because that's what the monitor was evaluating, his first compliance. Well, all 37 policies and procedures in accordance to the settlement agreement were drafted and approved by all the parties of the CASA and the monitoring team. So all 37 policies have been approved and implemented. Second step of that was training. And so all of the training dealing with those new policies had to be developed, approved, and implemented. So all of the CASA relating training has been done. And now third step is it working? So the question then becomes within the monitor's report to ask the question, and US CPCs have the right to ask that question, where does the monitor stand on those issues? And so I can tell you what APD thinks that the stance is policies, procedures, done, 37 of them, training, done. Now is it working is where we think we are.
There are some paragraphs that I think, to answer your question, that were probably weighted, meaning that there are some paragraphs that were not due right away. So then that would help to prioritize the APD's compliance, as well as all the other parties that are a part of the settlement agreement. So there were layers of it that weren't necessarily due right away.
And in fact, the schedule within the CASA was set up so that the deadlines for policies came up first, and then there were deadlines for training that came in. And that's why you saw some of the figures that you were seeing on this PowerPoint, because the understanding is that you have to have policies and you train from the policies, and then you have to see whether you actually incorporate those policies into the management structure. Part of the concern that happened here is that there was some delay in development of policies and some issues with policy development early on. And so those deadlines got extended, but then they started pushing up against the deadlines for training. And so you ended up sort of getting deadlines pushing up against each other, which is why you have some of the results that show up here.
That makes sense. The cascades, basically.
Yeah,
Right.
because
Well-
the two-year aspirational deadline didn't get pushed out, but all of the other deadlines were getting pushed out. And had those been done, you wouldn't have seen this same result. I think that it's because there was this very good intention of trying to achieve that two-year deadline. And I think unfortunately, as some of you have commented, the community and the public did not realize that these were aspirational deadlines, and therefore the interpretation is, oh, they didn't meet a deadline, and that is not accurate. I mean, they have been making progress and moving forward, and I think that that's continuing. We will see where the two-year report is in the next monitor's report. Just so you know, the next monitor's report covers 6 months instead of 4 months. So it covers from the beginning of August through the end of January. And so that report will be made public on May 2nd. And on May 8th at 9 o'clock, there will be the public hearing where Judge Brack will hear from the monitor and the parties on the report.
Okay. Now, is the monitoring criteria, is it consistent? Does it change at any given time according to whatever issue may come up? And, for example, an issue comes up and then a standard operating procedure needs to be thrown in there to be addressed or something? So is that monitoring criteria consistent? In other words, whatever you're going to monitor from 1 month to the next, it should be constant?
Can I ask a quick question? Why was it, I understand the reasonings for pushing the deadlines out. Is there a reason why the two-year, aspirational deadline, was it pushed as well? Is that something that couldn't be moved? Was
No,
that a hard, fast?
The city did not want to move that deadline. They were hoping to be able to meet the deadline. And, there are lots of good reasons for that. I mean, the reality is that the monitoring process is a time-consuming process and
Financial.
On the other hand, one of the benefits that communities across the country have seen when they're under these agreements is that as policies change, training takes place, and systems are changed, there is a significant reduction in lawsuits that arise from, and you see some significant savings then. But what we're dealing with right now is the fact that the city is having to pay for this process now. But I think you already are seeing the impact of some of these reforms just in terms of the sheer number of drops in officer-involved shootings. And quite frankly, the tremendous success that we see with the tactical units.
I'm curious, just one more question on the number 4 report. Other than the fact that there were dates that clearly weren't able to get met because of this aspirational deadline, were there other things in the monitor's report that were flagged to ABQ Forward when you guys reviewed it that were concerning? Were there steps backwards that you felt that APD in fact made? Or was it simply deadline driven, that they didn't meet the deadline criteria for the aspirational, results? I mean, are there things in the monitor's report that the monitor flagged that felt like there were steps backwards?
Yeah, one of them that brought to mind was that had to do with some of the training. I mean, where someone was still citing inappropriate law as part of the training. They were still having problems with definition and use of force. So, yes.
And there were concerns about the supervisor's investigations of use of force cases. That was highlighted, and it was highlighted in a special report prior to the 4th report coming out. And so those were concerns that were highlighted in the report.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So rounding everything over, thank you, sir. Rounding everything over, where are we percent-wise on the full agreement at this point? Where's our full percentage compliance?
Well, I mean, and that's the problem, is not really expressing it as a percent compliance. Probably the closest thing I showed you is this right here, understanding that, by and large, when you look at the categories and the monitoring team's evaluation of them, they're moving in the wrong direction. This particular graph shows you there's the first report, the second report, the third report, and the fourth report. So Now, the one thing that this does is it neutralizes, if stuff's not yet due, it's not yet due, so it's not going to affect the score, if you will. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, thank you.
Robbie, graph that showed the number of paragraphs that were in different levels of compliance. One, there were 232 in primary, and then you went up, and the number got smaller.
That's
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
that's where it comes out in the
And hold that for a minute.
Yeah, that's if you just calculate up what the monitor said for primary compliance was in compliance, and again, for the fourth report,
Yeah.
just
Can we get copies of this from you?
sorry,
Can we get copies of this from you?
the
Your
PowerPoint.
PowerPoint, yeah.
Sure.
Because I really like one of the things I really would like to share is what you put out as primary, secondary.
I mean,
operational
APD Forward would be happy to come and share things.
I think we're going to talk about that perhaps for April.
But I'll defer to our.
Yeah, have you talk about how this all works?
Yeah, I was just going to say, APD4, I think as far as that PowerPoint presentation goes, one of the things we want to do is make this information useful in telling the story to the community, and I'm not sure that we're quite ready at that point, so I think that we can distill this down to something that is more pleasing to the eye and easier to understand. And the other thing I want to point out is that on APD Forward's website, we've done our own independent analysis of each monitor's report, and that would kind of go to the question earlier, what are any of the issues that we've seen raised in those reports? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the big thing I really want is I would love to have a copy of that graphic of what the steps mean. So what does it mean for primary, secondary, operational compliance? Because that, I think, is something that we keep, it doesn't make intuitive sense to folks.
It should be on the website.
It's delineated in each one of the monitoring report in the very first.
But this is a much more digestible fashion.
It is, and I appreciate it.
We can put it in a graphic.
The one thing I will say too is that there the numbers tossed around, 278 paragraphs, 280 paragraphs, and everything. The first monitoring report reported out in 280 paragraphs. Then I think two of those, 138, 254, were really the monitor said these are just statements of fact. And so he just has footnote, or the monitoring team just has footnotes in the previous one. So if you find discrepancies in the numbers, if you drill down into the details, you'll find at least two or maybe three of those 280 paragraphs are not really being evaluated because they're just statements of fact. In order for APD to be constitutionally viable police force, we need these things to happen in the ensuing paragraph.
Thank you. I saw this presentation before and I thought it was fascinating, and I love the way that it's broken down and everything gets a score in real time. Granted, it's
Real
6
monitor
months.
time.
6 months. It's monitor time. It's 6 months old, but I really appreciate it, and I thought that you would appreciate it as well. So thank you very much for coming.